Okay, pick up where I left off. So we're into connective tissue. And so we want to talk a little bit about the cells of connective tissue, because even though connective tissue is driven by extracellular matrix, that's true, cells are still important, right? So we want to take a look at that. And for the most part, the cells kind of have a lot of similarities to them. So in terms of the types of cells, there's really 3, maybe 4 at times, basic types of cells throughout connective tissue. And you'll hear us refer to them throughout. But typically it ties, and that's true for all, just like general connective tissue, like cartilage or bone, they all have kind of the same root type of cell. And the only thing that changes is the prefix that defines them as either a bone cell or a cartilage cell or something like that. So we have 3 different types of cells. So we have what's called blast cells. Blast cells is a type of cell that creates matrix. So often, not always, they lay down connective tissue in development. And that means you're 0 to 9 months, right? So a lot of times, actually, when you take a look at like embryonic development and things like that, you'll very commonly hear these different types of blast types of cells. Various cells of like a myoblast, for instance, is an embryonic cell that's busy sort of laying down the progenitors of what eventually could become muscle. We'll talk about myoblasts a little bit later. But a blast cell in general is generally like the beginning cell. So this is the cell that's laying down new matrix, fresh matrix. Now, oftentimes, blasts will either be replaced by or grow up into an osteocyte. So this basically is a mature cell that does what? That maintains the matrix. So once you lay it down from scratch, that's the blast cell's job. Then oftentimes these blast cells will grow up into sites. And then from there on, they'll just be maintaining the matrix. So like just kind of replacing it, things like that, when you run into issues like wear and tear and things of that nature. Then you have what's called the clast. These guys will break down the matrix. So these are the deconstructionists. So just like you have cells that will lay it down, create the new matrix, you also have cells that will tear it apart. Same thing you do in construction, right? You have crews whose job it is to build new structures. You also have demolition crews whose job it is to come in and basically annihilate old, worn down, old structures so that they can replace it oftentimes with new material. And so every single connective tissue has a mixture of each of these. And depending on where you are in the connective tissue spectrum will determine which one of these 3 tends to be the more dominant personality of the tissue itself. So let's start off with an example. So we'll start off with the blasts, right? So the blast cells, a good example here would be osteoblasts. So notice this is the bone cells that are essentially responsible for laying down new bony matrix. Oftentimes in a pre-hardened form called osteoid. So osteoid is kind of like a form of bony matrix that hasn't been set up yet. So it hasn't been calcified into a hard, what we would refer to as hard bony structure. And so the osteoblasts will lay that down. And then oftentimes they will grow up into osteocytes, which will then maintain the bony matrix. And then the osteoclasts will break down the bony matrix. So we'll talk a little bit more about how all 3 of those activities work together when we get to the bone tissue. We'll have an entire chapter on bone histology where we'll probably talk about it more in depth. That's chapter 6. Chondroblasts, so chondro is cartilage. These guys will lay down the cartilaginous matrix. And then oftentimes they will mature and grow into chondrocytes, which will then maintain the longevity and the wear and tear, the replacement of damaged cartilaginous tissue. Oftentimes, if you damage cartilage, oftentimes what's happening is you'll generate a new group of osteoblasts to lay down new cartilaginous matrix. And then the osteocytes will maintain that cartilaginous matrix. It's not very fast process, which is one of the reasons why these soft tissue injuries are oftentimes take a long time to heal, because you're kind of in the process of trying to replace tissue that's been damaged with this new tissue, and you only have these blast cells to do that with. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time, depending on the extent of the damage and what needs to actually be done. And then, of course, fibroblasts. These guys are the ones who are laying down the connective tissue, what we refer to as connective tissue proper. So you have bone, cartilage, and then what we refer to as connective tissue. Like, so the stuff we've been talking about in histology, right, where you have your epithelial liner on your basement membrane, and the basement membrane basically is glued or founded on a foundation of connective tissue. That connective tissue, that kind of connective tissue, it's in your skin, that kind of forms that sort of loose fill foundational piece of it. That is the stuff of fibroblasts. And probably of all of these, to be quite honest with you, the most active of these blast cells is probably the fibroblasts, because you are by far injuring your connective tissue proper a lot more than you're injuring your cartilage or your bone. Okay. Why? Because think about it. How many times have you cut yourself in your life? Too many to count, right? How many times have you broken a bone? Some of you is never. Some of you, you can do that on one hand. Some of you daredevil types, right? You lost count. Or maybe you converted completely to titanium and plastic and Teflon. And you're like TSA's worst nightmare, right? It's like you're tripping off all the sirens. You got more metal in you than the plane, right? So that's that, right? But so fibroblasts are constantly active, because every time you damage your skin, your fibroblasts have to go in there and fix it. So these guys are usually constantly at work, and then they will oftentimes kind of kick it over to fibrocytes, which then kind of maintain the overall. So this is something that happens because when you get sort of this wholesale damage of the tissue, you have to kind of clean up the mess, and you have to replace what you lost. And that's where the fibroblasts come into play. Okay. So some other cells, less common cells, by the way, those are the big three, right? The blastocytes and the clasts, those are the big three. However, there are some other kind of what I call ancillary cells. Not ancillary in the sense of bad, but ancillary in the sense of they're kind of supportive cells that you don't see in all cell areas, but they do kind of interplay. They kind of come into play, right? So adipose, for instance, is one of those. So you have fat cells in various issues, especially like in the dermis and things of that nature. You can have fat pads in your joints, for instance, to kind of help reduce the wear and tear and the natural friction of a mobile joint. So you can have that. So those are types of cells that you'll see in there. Mast cells, which are part of the immune response. So these guys will basically be involved with inflammation or in kind of inflammation response. And so oftentimes what they'll do is they'll release certain things. So the mast cells are related to and similar to basophils in the sense that they're granular. That is to say, they have cytoplasmic granules, so they degranulate. So they have these like little granules in them of like different proteins and molecules and things like that in them that are kind of like it's like a little pocket, or it's like a little kernel of just different molecules in there that they need should they run into like an inflammation system. So when they run into inflammation, what happens is these guys have to communicate to the rest of the immune system so they can coordinate their activities. And the way they do that is by degranulating these little granules and releasing those signaling molecules out to the rest of the body, kind of like calling for backup, right? So if you're kind of the first officer on scene and it's like way out of your control, then you kind of call for backup and you make sure that everybody can hear you. And the types of molecules that you see in these like little granules are things like heparin, right? Some of you guys may have heard of heparin, right? So heparin is a vasodilator. So basically what it does is it dilates your arteries. Why? So that you can get faster flow of blood to the site of injury in this particular case, or the site of inflammation. so that you can get other immune cells to that site quickly. It's kind of like the physiological version of everybody pulling to the side of the road to allow a clear pathway so the ambulance can go by. Okay, that's kind of similar sort of thing. Histamine, which is also a type of dye. So these are working on your blood vessels to basically make sure that you can get the people that you need to get there, right? And then proteolytic enzymes. So these basically will attack and break up proteins themselves. White blood cells, the other members of the immune system, those will also oftentimes be patrolling around the connective tissue as well, or in those regions of the connective tissue. Why? Because this is kind of like a garrison of bodyguards. Because think about it for a second. Let's just take a look at your dermis, right? The connective tissue in your skin. Where's the most likely entry point for a bacterium to enter your body? Yeah, your cut, right? The cut that you just made. So more than likely, if a bacterium gets into your body, it's because there's an open wound on your hand. And you have entrance or access to that connective tissue. So in this particularly high vulnerable area, you have a patrol of troops making sure they secure this area so that if the bacteria does get in there, they immediately go on kill and you never have to worry about getting sick. Okay. It's the exact same thing that Denver police does. It's the reason why they don't pay attention to us, right? Because where they're hanging out, they're patrolling the areas that have the highest crime rates and the areas that are the biggest issues, right? Because the idea is they need to keep them under control. Otherwise, it's going to turn into anarchy quick, right? And so that's kind of where they focus things. A type of white blood cell, that's what, like 12 times in the last 30 seconds. Okay, so is the macrophages. So macrophages are a specific subset of white blood cells that have the capacity to phagocytize. Now, what is phagocytizing? For lack of a more biological, accurate definition, this is basically when one cell gobbles up another. Now, one of the ways basically that your white blood cells fight against bacteria is they phagocytize them. They basically engulf them, and then they sick what on them? Their proteolytic enzymes get sicked on those bacteria. That's like your digestive enzymes, right? So then what's going to happen? Those digestive enzymes are going to digest up the bacterium, and you got yourself a dead bad guy, right? And so that's what macrophages do. And you'll see these guys kind of patrolling around in your connective tissue. And there's usually two subsets of macrophages that you see in your body. There's what's called a fixed group. And so these guys are just like an outpost. So this is kind of like a permanent outpost in connective tissue. And you can kind of see this, right? Because as you kind of go around the city, when you take a look at kind of where the police are, there's clearly areas of the city where there's like a permanent presence of the police there. They don't really go there. They just kind of rotate in and out of there, but there's always somebody there, right? And that's kind of like what these fixed macrophages are. There's like a permanent outpost of security there. And then you've got the patrollers. So this is basically the patrol unit, who then will kind of roam about the city, making sure that everybody's not running red lights and, you know, squashing the pedestrians and stuff like that, and otherwise trying to stay within relative bounds of legality. And so between the two of them, they basically have most of your connective tissue well patrolled. By the way, this is a common theme that you're going to see actually even going over into AMP2 as well. Oftentimes, whenever you have a part of your body that is open access to the outside world, you will almost always see a garrison of macrophages that act as sort of like a platoon to protect you from outside invasion. You've got macrophage populations that are associated with your digestive system because you're ingesting things from the outside world. You've got a garrison of macrophages in your lungs because you're breathing in air from the outside world, and so forth. And so this is a common theme where whenever you have contact with the outside world, you have a bit of a platoon of an immune presence by way of the macrophages. Okay, and typically these macrophages will have like specific names. You know, they won't be that, oh, that's a macrophage. It's like in the lungs, for instance, the macrophages that are kind of patrolling inside your lungs and just making sure there's no bad guys getting inhaled are called dust cells. But they're actually macrophages that kind of patrol around in there. Okay. Also part of your white blood cell grouping are the platelets, right? So these are actually fragments of a cell called a megakaryocyte, which is one of the cells in your that's developing in your bone marrow, along with the other white blood cells and red blood cells. And so these are like little chunks or fragments of a white blood cell, megakaryocyte. And so what these guys are involved in is clotting. So if you were to injure yourself, then these guys will basically go in there and plug the hole. That way you don't hemorrhage out before you get a chance to heal the wound, right? That's always the first. I mean, if you've ever been in a flood, or if your basement's ever flooded, like during a flash flood, you know that the immediate and overwhelming first initial goal is stop the flooding, right? And you basically do anything you can. I mean, if it's coming through a basement window, I mean, you've got, you know, towels plugging it up, you've got chewing gum, I mean, you've got the family dog, right? It's like whatever you can grab, it doesn't matter, just stop, make it stop, and then figure out how to fix it permanently afterwards, right? But the idea is make it stop, or you're on the hook for like tens of thousands of dollars to reconfigure your basement, especially if you've got a finished basement. If you've had a finished basement that's flooded, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's one of the reasons why I don't finish my basement. And when I look at finished basements, I'm like, yeah, that's really nice, but I'm not stupid. I know what happens in basements, right? They're either getting flooded or you bury bodies under there, right? It's one of those two. That's spoken like a true AMP person, right? Yeah. So then you also have some of these what's called stem cells, and these guys are important, right? And so because when you're talking about these cells, especially like any of these cells, by the way, these all have their own stem cells. Like you don't have to worry about white blood cells. They got their own stem cells. They're in the bone marrow. That's happening. But what these guys are talking about is you need some way of making either new blast cells, site cells, or class cells, right? Because what's going to happen is you're not going to have an infinite source of these. It's not like you're going to be born with like just an open faucet of cells here. The thing is, you don't want to make a bunch of cells that you're not going to use. So you have what you have because you need it at that time. Now, once these blast cells grow up into site cells, let's say, for instance, you injure yourself, then all of a sudden, you've just thrown yourself from a maintenance kind of a level of activity now to having to rebuild. And that's a different sort of a thing, right? Because now all of a sudden, you've got all these sites that are just maintaining matrix, but now all of a sudden you immediately find yourself in a position to have to rebuild tissue. That means you have to figure out a way to lay down new tissue. Well, that basically means you need more blasts. And guess what you don't have right now? A bunch of blasts, right? Because they've all grown up to become sites. So what that means is you have to have a way of replenishing these cell reservoirs so that you can actually create or upregulate and build more blast cells so that you can lay down new tissue to kind of heal the wound, right? And the stem cells are what causes this. So you always have like just a small little pocket of stem cells that are always in your pocket, so that if you find yourself in need of more blast cells, then you can just basically kick these stem cells into a hyperdrive and they can start spitting out new fresh cells for you, okay? But that's the reason why you always need these stem cells, and they're always laying around. So since we have a tissue that's dominated by extracellular matrix, let's take a look at what's actually in the extracellular matrix itself. We talked about it a little bit, but there's a couple of major themes that we see across all of them. The first one is when we take a look at our extracellular matrix, we have a couple of major things. First of all, we got protein fibers. That's one, right? So there's different types of protein fibers. We'll take a look at each one of those. The second one that we have is what's called ground substance. So this is kind of like a mysterious fluid, right? So it's basically a fluid that's kind of slippery. And it can be gel-like. So you can have different consistencies of ground substance, but this is kind of like the fluidy, kind of quasi-liquidy portion of extracellular matrix. So it tends to be soft in nature. Now, within this, oftentimes you always will, regardless of what cell you are, you will always basically make some sort of ground substance. And I mean, we don't have time to really get into the kind of nitty gritty of the components of ground substance. There's probably maybe about a half dozen different things roughly that kind of can be added into ground substance of different types. And depending on what you're going for will kind of determine what kind of ground substance you make, right? So like if you're looking for a more fluidy type of ground substance, it'll look a little bit different than if somebody's trying to go for more like a gel-like ground substance. So you'll kind of like, but the idea is between these 6 molecules, which usually are like these protein carbohydrate sort of fusion proteins, you'll have a series of these that you'll add to your ground substance to give you various consistencies that you're going for, okay? And so you'll always lay down that ground substance to kind of create the overall kind of matrix, the body of the matrix. And then to that ground substance, you're going to add a series of different protein fibers. And what you lay down and how much you lay down is completely tethered to what you're trying to get accomplished as a tissue. So the first one that we want to take a look at is collagen, our good friend, collagen. And so collagen is probably one of the most common ones you see. And typically this one is tough. So this is a tough one. So this gives you a lot of structural support. It does have some flexibility, but it's very limited flexibility. It's actually straight line flexibility, but it is inelastic. Now, here's a good example. If you want to know what almost pure collagen looks like, grab your Achilles heel. That is a tendon that connects your gastrocnemius to the back of your heel. And that's almost pure collagen. And that's pretty tough, right? Now, if you've ever damaged your Achilles, you know that your Achilles in straight line is very tough and strong. So as long as I keep the force of my pressure up and down, going down the length of my Achilles tendon is actually quite strong and flexible. However, if I were to impose a lateral force to it, not so much, right? So it's strong, but only in one direction. Now, reticular is a little bit different. It'll have collagen in it, but it's a much finer consistency of collagen. So it's notice we don't say it's collagen, it's collagenous. So it's similar to collagen, but not exactly like what we just saw in the first one, right? So it's very fine. But basically what this does is it kind of fills spaces in tissues and organs. And remember, this basically creates a framework, kind of like a cubicle. And you generally only see it in organs, right? So collagen you see outside of organs, and inside organs you see reticular tissue. And so a lot of you guys remember seeing the reticular tissue in the example of the spleen, when you guys looked at the spleen slide, and those like little dark fibers were the reticular tissue that kind of created these like little, like a good cubicle is a good example, right? Because a cubicle is a false wall, right? It's a temporary wall that you put up inside a room. So it's not your cubicle wall is not a load-bearing wall, right? Right. So it's just purely designed and intended to just organize space, right? And to provide a little bit of structure to an otherwise open room. And so reticular tissue is very much the same. So it basically divides up the space in an organ and creates like little pockets and cubicles and things of that nature, and then kind of gives that organ overall structure. The example of the organ turning into applesauce in the absence of that is a really good analogy, okay? Because organs, which are all cellular for the most part, don't have any structural framework. So if you don't have that reticular tissue in there, then it's just going to all go to mush. An alternative analogy that you may use if you are so inclined, if you're outdoorsy or not, is kind of like a tent, right? Where the reticular tissue would be like the poles of the tent. And you probably put up a tent enough times to realize that without those poles, what does your tent look like? Mush, right? It's like nothing. the exact same thing is also true. So your poles would be like reticular tissue. Is it a load-bearing structure? No, not at all, right? But what all it's designed to do is to give your tent a little bit of shape and frame, right? So that you can do what? Go inside without everything caving in on you, right? That's exactly what's happening in an organ when reticular tissue kind of keeps up the tent so that all these little red blood cells and things like that can kind of hang out and do their little thing. Okay. So those are important. And then of course we have elastic tissue. Now these guys are oftentimes seen, probably the next most common one next to collagen. But what they are is basically full of proteins made of what's called elastin. And these guys are very flexible. And they oftentimes will be crossing. So what that means is you have these long fibers of elastin. And when you cross-link a protein fiber, is you create a molecule that kind of connects them laterally like this. So that kind of gives them a little bit of structure. But because they're flexible, they can distend and compress. So think of a rubber band. Okay. So this gives you your flexibility. So use this one for your flexibility. So those are your protein fibers. And then of course your ground substance, one of the big things in your ground substance is hyaluronic acid. Some of you guys have probably seen this on shelves at some place, right? So you take your hyaluronic acid supplement or something of that nature. Well, that's because it's a component of ground substance. So the idea with that one, and it's usually a cosmetic thing, right? So the whole thing about hyaluronic acid is that it's part of your ground substance. So if you're like getting wrinkles or whatever, that means your connective tissue, right, which is extracellular matrix, is breaking down and it's no longer able to maintain the normal level of the skin. So it's kind of starting to sink down as it kind of starts to decay like a sinkhole. So the idea is if you take ground substance components and you add that to there, it's going to build that back up and it's going to remove your wrinkles, right? That's the idea. Doesn't really work that way, but that's the idea anyway. Whatever gets you to buy it. But this is basically a polysaccharide, right? And it's slippery. So this is basically a lubricant that kind of creates that sort of slippery consistency that we talked about of ground substance itself. Now, in that, then you're going to have some protein hybrid molecules. You got a couple of them in there. One of a big family of them is what's called proteoglycans. So this is a big family of different types of specific molecules. So you have these protein carb hybrid molecules. And that's the proteoglycan family, right? So proteo for the protein part, that's the protein part. Glycan is the carb part. There's different types of proteoglycans in there, but typically these will have different types like glycosaminoglycans. That's a specific type of proteoglycan. So the glycosamino piece that's the protein component. Right there, the amino part is the protein component. Glyco is the carbohydrate component. But basically, these proteoglycans will actually attach to the hyaluronic acid. And this creates kind of like a large net. That holds water. Right. And so, I mean, a lot of times, you know, when you're taking a look at things like, especially in the winter, right, which is our dry season in Colorado, right, super dry. I mean, a lot of people you're just like bathing in lotion, right? And a lot of those lotions are designed to be what? Moisturizers. Right? The idea is they're trying to trap water in these little net-like structures of connective tissue instead of it evaporating off of your skin, and then your skin starts to get dry and cracks. And if you've seen my hands lately, it's like I can't even bend my hand anymore because it's like my skin will just rip off. It's a wonderful sensation, but right, that's kind of part of that, right? That idea of the moisture angle of skin treatment and things of that nature. That's kind of where that comes from. So it traps water and keeps your skin nice and supple. And then you'll have different types out there, and they kind of put this in ground substance, but in reality, these could also probably break into the protein area as well. The problem is these are very, these aren't in every tissue. That's the reason why they're not part of the protein group, because it's not a common thing. They do have them out there, depends on what you want to get, but that's adhesive molecules. So these are just basically like these sort of proteoglycan molecules whose job is very specific, and that's to connect your extracellular matrix. Like fibronectin basically connects your extracellular matrix to the cell itself, or rather the cell gets anchored to the extracellular matrix by these connections. So these basically will anchor the cell to the ECM. That's what their job is to do. And the reason why they kind of put those in there as ground substance is because that's just the cell hanging on, right, to its environment. And so those are kind of a little bit different. That's kind of a little bit of a difference between that and what's going on with the rest of the ground substance. So it has a very specific job. So it's kind of what it looks like. So here's your nice collagen fibers. You can see nice linear fibers of protein all laid down in a kind of a cable of fibers. So you see this kind of complex of multiple collagen fibers. It's basically like a rope, right? That's kind of what's happening is you're laying this down into these long fibers. That's like a fiber of fibers of fibers. And so if you've ever looked at an expansion bridge, like the Golden Gate, if you've ever looked at the cables of the expansion bridge, if you look at it, it's just basically like a giant cable of cables, right? So the whole cable itself is composed of smaller cables, which are all composed of smaller cables, which are composed of smaller cables, which are composed of smaller cables. And so just kind of, they're like nested all into each other. So by the time you get to the big one, it's able to hold up the entire bridge. Okay. And connect the peninsula with Marin, the North and the South Peninsula. So the elastic fibers are connected. So here you can kind of see these squirrely little elastic fibers. They kind of look like little, rubber band kinds of things interconnected with these cross links. So you can see this is descended. So this is a relaxed view of it. And then when you pull it, not unlike you do with transitional epithelium, right? It kind of flattens out. And so you kind of get this flattened look. So this kind of gives you that elasticity. So the reason why you have the cross linking is so that you don't break the system, right? Because if you didn't have the cross linking, then what you would simply do is you just pull the fibers apart, and it'd just be like pulling apart cotton candy, right? So that's not useful, right? So having them cross-linked together basically ensures that you're not going to, just pull everything apart. You'll pull it apart, they'll stretch, and then you let it go, and then they recoil back to this, and you pull it apart again, and they'll stretch, but the resisting complete destroy because they're cross-linked. Those cross-links are holding everything together, so you're not able to just pull it apart, okay? And that's important. Now, the proteoglycans, this is probably one of the best images in any textbook, actually, that I've ever seen. Usually most of them are just a bunch of cartoons, like, weird little Mickey Mouse faces. And I mean, literally, that's how useful they are. They're just dumb, right? But this is a really, really good detailed image of what a proteoglycan looks like. Because a lot of times students will hear that term. It's like, okay, I understand that proteo means protein, glycan means carbohydrate, and we got a fusion protein that kind of has personalities of both, right? But what does that mean exactly? I mean, right? Because if I took general bio, which you may or may not have, we also talked about glycoproteins, which, by the way, are also protein carbohydrate hybrid molecules. But in this case, it's mostly protein with a little bit of a carbohydrate branch on it, right? So how are these different than like a glycoprotein? Because it's clearly not a glycoprotein, it's a proteoglycan, right? So how does this differ? Because not every protein carbohydrate hybrid is a proteoglycan. This is what it looks like. So here you can see down here in the middle, you'll see this kind of long sort of central shaft, right? So they're trying to show that that's kind of like your acid, your hyaluronic acid, which is would basically just kind of like an organic acid with lots of carbons, kind of like all sort of linked down into like a long chain, not unlike like a fatty acid or something of that nature. But basically to this long carbonaceous chain, then you're going to have tethered to it or actually linked on it these individual like linkage proteins, and then to that you're going to have your this kind of protein carbohydrate piece. So typically right here, when you take a look at this shaft here, usually what's happening here is you've got a kind of a protein shaft with little carbohydrate pairs on the side of it. I actually may have that backwards. I have to double check on that one. Either way, right, you've got sort of a shaft with basically this kind of extension, these carbohydrate extensions, and then each one of these is basically linked to one of these linkage proteins. So you have this really long system of these kind of protein chains with these carbohydrate extensions on them. And so that's very unique in structure. So this does not, if you remember studying glycoproteins in general bio, this looks nothing like a glycoprotein. Okay, this is something very unique and very different. And it has a lot of that kind of carbohydrate-like personality to it, because there's like a lot of carbohydrate on this. So it's a combination. It literally is a very much a very cohesive combination of protein and carbohydrate. They're pretty even. I wouldn't say quite 1-to-1 ratio, but certainly closer than like a glycoprotein or something like that. Glycoprotein is mostly like 90% protein, just a sliver of it is carbohydrate. This is much more like 1-to-1. There's an equal sharing here of carbohydrate and protein. So that's a great image. I like that one. So score 1 for McGraw-Hill. Actually, no, I won't give McGraw-Hill that point. Score 1 for Seeley, because Seeley is the one who wrote this. So she's the one who gets the credit for it. It's just unfortunate that she happened to have a contact with them. But anyway. Okay, so now let's take a look at the classification, right? You knew we were going to get to this point at some point, right? So let's take a look at the classification of connective tissue. So there's obviously a couple of different ways to look at it. We've already kind of slightly mentioned it in passing, right? That there's different types of connective tissue. So we want to put this together in sort of a logical way, similar to the way we did for epithelial tissue. And so obviously the first group is going to be the embryonic connective tissue. Now, normally speaking, we don't spend a lot of time on the embryonic tissues because largely they've kind of grown up to become us. And so we spend more time in us. But one of the ones that are worth pointing out and remembering, because we're going to hit these guys later on in some of the later tissues, is like mesenchyme connective tissue. These are tissues that will help us to maintain and to create new tissues when we need it in our body now. And of course, we have mucous connective tissue, which is embryonic, and it kind of still continues to produce material for us even now, right? So these are embryonic sources of connective tissue. Now, in the adult connective tissue, which is where we're going to spend most of our time. So this is where you want to really focus your attention. We can break connective tissue up in a couple of ways. Now, something that we call connective tissue proper, which kind of sounds a little on the odd side, right? That's a moral judgment, right? So that's proper, not proper, right? That's so. How do you know proper versus not proper? And it's basically it's very simple. Generally speaking, intuitively, if I ask you to point to some connective tissue, chances are you're going to be pointing to some sort of a connective tissue proper tissue. Okay, so oftentimes this is tissue that's associated with just kind of overall body support. The so-called non-proper, we don't really call it non-proper, which is the other tissues, have a much more targeted, specific function. So the reason why we call these connective tissue proper is because they're generalists. And so they kind of cut across a lot of different organ systems and a lot of different tissue types, okay, and what they do. So within connective tissue proper, we have a couple of different types. So we have different types of what's called loose connective tissue. Typically speaking, these guys tend to be ground substance dominated. They have fewer protein fibers involved in them. And our examples of loose are areolar tissue, which some of you guys remember seeing on the microscopes. Adipose tissue is a type of loose connective tissue as well. We talked about that one. And reticular tissue, which we talked about, is also a type of loose connective tissue. Now, if it's not loose, then it's what? Well, it's dense, right? So the next one is dense. Typically, this has a lot of protein fibers in it and less ground substance. So oftentimes, dense means more structure. And so some examples there is you have dense regular, dense irregular, and that's collagenous, and of course the same is dense, regular, and irregular elastic. So it depends on which protein fibers you have in there, right? So if you have largely collagen, then you're either going to be dense, regular, dense, irregular. And if you have a lot of elastin, you'll be dense, irregular with elastin in it. So more of an elastic type of thing. Generally speaking, we tend to talk more about dense, regular, irregular, usually with respect to collagen, usually. Okay. So these guys are important because their role is largely supportive, general support. You'll hear me use a term, especially if you take me for AMP2. And I usually use this term and I say loose fill. Imagine this, you're building a tissue. You've got a blood vessel over here, right? You've got a gland over here. Maybe you have an epithelial liner up here. Maybe there is a muscle over here. Well, guess what? Those can't be separated by empty space. So you have to take that empty space and you got to fill it with something. That something is some type of connective tissue. That's what I mean by loose fill. The question is, which one do you fill it with? Well, it depends on the nature of where you are. If it's like a very internal area with not a lot of physical strain and stress, you can probably get by with something like areolar, right? Which is a structurally weaker loose fill. If you need something that is a little more structurally robust filler, then you switch to the easiest of the dense ones, which is dense irregular. That's if your tissue area is going to be incorporating a lot of physical strain and stress. So I have a couple of options here to use in terms of connective tissue based on what I perceive is going to be happening. Okay. And so a lot of these tissues, whether they're loose or dense, will have similar roles, but they're designed for different circumstances. Okay. Now, as it turns out, it's not all expensive to just lay down dense irregular, so you see a lot of that. By the way, what do you see in your skin? You see mostly the pink swirls, right? That is dense irregular. Why? Because your skin is under constant physical stress and strain. If you were to take a look at the connective tissue immediately underneath, say, your parietal layer, like lining one of your cavities, like your thoracic cavity or something like that, is it going to be dense or irregular? No, because you don't have a lot of that physical stress and strain. You can get by with a little bit of a layer of areolar in there because you just need to fill the space. It doesn't have to be super strong. You just need to fill it up and to bind all your stuff together, your artery to your gland to your muscle, to bind it all together. It doesn't have to be strong because it's not going to be a lot of physical stress on there. And so you just use the cheapest thing, right? So you only upgrade if you feel like your current grade is not working. That makes sense? So that's connective tissue proper. So you can imagine there's, and none of that, but remember, with your fibers, it's not like you have to pick either or, right? Because in all of these, by the way, just always remember with your protein fibers, it's not like you're saying, oh, well, I've got to pick one. It's got to be either collagen or elastin. No. It's going to be always a ratio, collagen to elastin. Structure, stability. So you can, just like your Achilles heel is all structure, high collagen, very little elastin. Other tissues, which need to be more elastic, are going to be mostly elastin, very little collagen, but you can have any amounts of variations in between. So depends on what you're doing, right? So you don't have just one or the other. It's a combination of the two, and it comes in varying ratios. That gives you a lot of flexibility and a lot of variation just in your connective tissue to be able to strike just the right amount of structure with just the right amount of flexibility in there. And you can really fine tune it perfectly. Okay, and you see that a lot. Okay, the next major grouping of connective tissue is what's called the so-called supporting connective tissue. Typically, these guys are very specific in terms of their main support structures. So we're talking about cartilage is one of them, right? Which is kind of like a semi-solid matrix. Typically, there's different types of cartilage. There's what's called hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. We'll talk about that a little bit more down the line. And then, of course, you have bone, right? So this is a solid matrix. It's hard. And so we have two different types of bone. You have spongy bone and you have compact bone. We'll talk more about that when we get to the bone physiology chapter. So bone has its own physiology chapter. And so that's supporting. And then you have fluid, which a lot of times students don't realize is a connective tissue, but it actually is. And so any of your fluids, like blood, for instance, is a support system to your red blood cells and white blood cells. So it is a type of connective tissue. It does fit that supportive role. And then also your marrow, technically speaking, is a connective tissue. Why? Because your bone marrow is a kind of a it's a kind of a spongy kind of a texture-ish sort of stuff that basically creates a supportive framework within which your white blood cells and red blood cells can develop and grow up and ultimately become, big cells, right? Ready for the big leaps, so to speak. It's kind of like the cellular version or the hematological version of the minor leagues, right? So this is where you go to learn your craft, and then you get released to the bloodstream to go and try to win championships, right? And you got 120 days to do so before you die. So it's a pretty rough contract, at least for red blood cells it is. That can also be for white blood cells as well. So because you're destined to die, right? So it's not cellular biology is not for the timid. Okay, so these are the embryonic tissues, the mesenchymal cells, which will basically form. So these are kind of generic cells. These are oftentimes, when you take a look at embryonic tissue, oftentimes embryonic tissue is undifferentiated. What that means is it hasn't really become anything yet. It doesn't become anything until a little later on. And so mesenchymal cells are actually quite important for that particular purpose. Because they haven't become differentiated, oftentimes they are a valuable source. So if you can get, that's, by the way, stem cells are the same way. They haven't differentiated anything, which is the reason why we hang on to those, because we can make more of those and create more cells. And then we can say, okay, you go ahead and you turn into this, right? I need more this fibroblasts, for instance. So you go and you become a fibroblast, right? And so that's the value of having these undifferentiated cells. And the reason why mesenchymal cells are helpful. Mucus, of course, would be probably considered kind of part of the fluid group, right? Because mucus actually is quite interesting, because mucus can range in terms of consistency, which is why mucus is a really fascinating connective tissue in the body, more so than any other, because mucus can be very thin and runny, like very watery. We've all had the water faucet nose before, right? That's a perfect example. Or it can be quite thick and quite substantial. I mean, it all depends on how much water you trap in that mucus, depends on how the consistency of it. And so like a sticky, thick mucus can be used for one set of things, right? And a thin, runny mucus can be used for others. Like a thin, runny might be good for like lubrication or something of that nature. A thick one would be good for like a barrier. A good example is the inside of your stomach liner is lined with mucus. But a lot of times students be like, well, wait a minute, you mean that's what's protecting me from the acid, for me burning myself? Yeah, but it's not just mucus. It's not like this mucus. It's not like mucus that you think about when you have a bad cold. It's a thicker, more substantial version of mucus. So it's got a little bit more robustness. So it's not just going to sort of fall apart as soon as that acid hits it, because it's thicker and it's not as runny as the mucus that we normally encounter. Yes, phlegm is mucus. That's all phlegm is the mucus of your trachea that's basically come up. So you coughed up some particles or something like that. But that's another kind of a thicker type of mucus because you want to trap stuff in there. You don't just, want it to just kind of glance across a really thin, watery mucus. You want it to get sticky in there, right? So you want to trap those particles in there. And so that's your embryonics. Your areolar tissue, this should look familiar. Yes, looks similar to what you guys saw with your slides. So your areolar tissue is kind of like your loose fill. So notice they even actually call it loose packing. And so this is where you fill open spaces and open cavities, but you don't have a lot of structural requirements for this particular area. And so oftentimes you'll see this kind of mixed in often with other types of connective tissue. And so that's your areolar connective tissue. Your adipose tissue we saw, right? These are basically fat tissues. This has a whole range of things, right? Not only can you pack stuff, can you like fill out your body, but it's insulation. We talked about that one. This is our energy storage part, right? This is basically some of the functions of your fat layer, basically. And it's also protection, right? This is there's a couple of reasons here, first of all, why weight loss can be somewhat alarming. All right, we usually think in the West of weight loss being a good thing, but from an organismal standpoint, it can actually be damaging because your fat layers are there for a reason. It's not a cosmetic thing. It's a biology thing, right? So now, obviously, if there's too much fat, then obviously that's a problem. And that's the Western thing. It's not the existence of fat, it's having too much fat. And that's, by the way, that's the Western problem across the board, right? We suffer in the West from the Texas mentality. We tend to live in polar extremes, not in sensible middle ground. And we tend to fluctuate like bipolar style from one extreme to the next, as if one cancels out the other, which it doesn't, right? So you'll die if you burn yourself up or if you freeze yourself to death. Better to live right about room temperature, but somehow in the West, we are just not good at figuring that one out. So it's not that fat exists, it's that there's too much. And so it's good as an insulator, right? Especially if you live in cold climates. By the way, look at the mammals. They can tell you what good biology is. Cold climate animals have a habit, an instinctual habit of fattening up. Why? Because that's the only way they're going to live through the winter. So in cold climates, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Having that insulator, that insulating layer of fat, is a good idea. It means you're probably less likely to die. I'm thinking of like To Build a Fire, Jack London, right? That's a great story. If you've ever read it, it's hilarious, tragic. That's exactly what I think of when Luke was talking to me about Wisconsin, right? Is to build a fire. And of course, like, being an avid hiker in my younger days anyway, my knees don't support it so much anymore these days, but reading that novel, it's like you're screaming at it because you're like picking up on all the mistakes that he's making. It's like, no, you don't do that out there if it's like minus 90 degrees. First of all, number one is you're out there in minus 90 degrees, first of all, right? And so there's just a whole laundry list of things where it's like, no, if you just didn't do that, if you just did something different, like don't build your fire underneath the tree because the heat convection is going to cause the snow to fall on your fire, which is exactly what happens. And then somehow he manages to get in his simple water. And so he did everything wrong from an outdoors perspective. I mean, everything. It was kind of, yeah, but it's energy. It's good for energy storage, right? Remember, your body does not think of your fat as a cosmetic thing. It thinks of your fat as a survival thing, right? Because whether you like it or not, your body doesn't know that you can basically eat at will. Which, by the way, we're the only species who can do that. I mean, our dogs are pretty close, but they can't even eat at will, can they? You know why? Because all 6 of my dogs would be in a food coma right now if they ate whenever they wanted to. Right? So they don't even eat at will. They eat pretty good, right? But they don't eat at will. We are the only ones who can eat at will. And there's nothing in our way. We can basically hook ourselves up to the McDonald's IV.
That's a horrible thought. I'm nightmares now.
And we will probably be dead within a week if that's what we did. But it'd be a great ride, right? That 1 week would be that if you're a McDonald's person. But right, that's energy storage. By the way, have you ever wondered why it's so easy to gain weight and so hard to lose it? By the way, that's not something that's individual. That's across the board. It varies in severity between different individuals. Teenagers don't count, right? We're talking about grown-ups now. And it varies at stages in life, right? But it is universal across the board. It takes no effort whatsoever to gain weight and an enormous amount of effort to lose it. Why? Yeah, you know why? Because your body sees your fat as an energy source. Your body doesn't know there's a McDonald's on every corner. And that food is cheap enough to buy whenever you want it. At least now it is. Wait until inflation triples again, right? What it thinks is that you're still out there on the Serengeti, and what you just ate could be the last meal in a while. The famine is right around the corner, and all your food sources are going to dry up. I'm talking about you, wildebeest, right? Your grazing lands that you rely on are going to dry up because the grasses will die once the famine hits. And you're not going to have enough energy to migrate long distances to go find other greener pastures. So guess what? The lean, mean marathon runners are going to be the first ones to die. Why? Because they have no stored energy. They'll be the first ones to die. Those of us, maybe who have a few layers on us, will make it. And we'll survive the famine, and then we'll repopulate. And that's the way your body thinks of yourself. Your body still thinks you're out there in the Serengeti, which is the reason why it does not let your fat go. That's why it's so hard to burn fat. It's because of that. Because your body is biologically wired to hang on to that because it has to make sure you live through the famine. Unless you run a marathon, in which case you're going to be dead right off, right? So you'll be the first one to die, but you'll look great, right? But nobody will care, right? Because in biology, the ultimate goal in biology is for every organism to reproduce. That's it, right? That is the biological purpose of every organism on the planet, reproduce. You can't reproduce if you're dead, can you, marathon runner? Which is the reason why I made the comment that those of us with a little bit of carriage will make it through the famine and repopulate the earth, right? You like how I put that there? Yeah. Right, so that's the reason why. And of course, organs, right? You don't want to get rid of all your fat. Why? Because your fat reserves are actually very important in protecting your organs. Your organs would be massively damaged if you didn't have layers of fat on them to protect them. And that's, so your fat is really, and I always like to kind of park it a little bit on that one, because in Western society, especially the post-fitness generation, where we just sort of lost our minds in the 80s, and we just completely just went off the deep end, and we haven't really come back yet. We just get a little weirder and weirder every generation. We've demonized fats like so badly that it's like we're even beyond like normal reason. It's like the idea that, you know, the things that we think are demons are actually normal. Like you need them or you're going to be dead. So this is an example of Americans going like from one wild polar extreme to the next, right? And so am I saying that you need to bulk up so that you have to cut a wall out of your house to get out of it? No. No. Right, yeah, like, that's what I was going for. No, right? But am I also saying that you basically need to sort of lean up to where you're a shadow of yourself? Of course not, right? Those are two extremes. I mean, when you study physiology, what you realize is your body is a centrist. Our brains tend to be polar extremes, but your body is a centrist. And it wants to behave as a centrist. And that's kind of the reason why we get a little whacked out. Okay. So reticular tissue, you can see this is going to be your spleen. This is a really good image of a spleen. So you can see these little dark reticular fibers kind of forming the little cubicle structure within which these little pink spots, which are red blood cells, are kind of hanging out so that they don't have the whole tent collapsing in on their head. That's basically reticular tissue. Then you have your dense regular, right? This is our collagenous tissue. This is our tough stuff. So here you see a couple of different images. I like this, right? Because you can see that the same thing is true for all of them. What dense regular is typified by collagen. It's mostly all collagen, by the way, but it's laid down in these smooth sheets. So you can see these like wave-like sheets. That's almost pure collagen. That's what your Achilles tendon would look like. Okay, it's almost pure collagen. So that's dense irregular. So you're really looking at structural support. That's what you're looking for right now, is if you're dealing with this type of tissue. If you go into dense irregular, a lot of you guys remember seeing this, yes? Yeah. Because I know some of you guys were asking me about this. But this is dense irregular. Now take a look at this. Here's our scalp slide. You remember seeing that, right? You see your epidermis up there, and then right underneath it, you see these kind of like pink swirly looking structure. That's kind of pink swirly area. That's all dense irregular. Dense irregular is a type of loose packer, right? It's a packing material, but it's more structurally robust packing material, right? You wouldn't want to put areolar tissue here because it wouldn't have enough structural capacity to withstand the wear and tear that you put on your skin. So this is a version of the filler that gives you more integrity, structural integrity. And this is kind of what it looks like up close. So you can see this irregular kind of swirling look. This is all collagen still, right? Where you kind of have these little pink swirls of tissue kind of all over the place. You see that a lot, actually, everywhere. Now, the elastic tissue is a little bit different. It can look similar, but the fibers are different. So here, I mean, this would be a little mean, right? We didn't really look at dense, just elastic versus collagen, because that would be more like a histology class that would do that. But notice what you see here is you see a similar type of a framework, right? A similar idea, but what you're doing now is instead of laying down collagen, you're laying down elastin. So this is basically elastin fibers now. So it's more flexibility. The vocal cords is the one they use. I think that's probably the best one, right? Because your vocal cords have to have a little bit of flexibility in them so that you can kind of manipulate it in order to get the different sounds that you need to get out of your voice. So this is a perfect example of more of an elastic version. But you have to have dense tissue, right? It has to be dense and regular in this particular case. Why? Because you're using it a lot, right? I mean, right now, I've been pretty much talking all day long. You can imagine what my vocal cords, the kind of work that my vocal cords have gone through. So the fact that there's a lot of wear and tear, a lot of high use on it means you have to probably lean toward more of a dense, regular type of a scenario. But since they have to be a little bit malleable, flexible, then they have to be out of elastic instead of collagen. And then, of course, dense irregular elastic is also kind of mixed in usually with dense irregular collagenous, because in your skin, you don't just have collagen, you also have flexibility. So those pink swirls are not all collagen. It's a combination of collagen and elastin. Okay. So that's the reason why usually you don't see a separation between, oh, this is collagen, this is elastin. There's usually a mixture in there. Okay. The vocal cords are like an outlier in that sense. Okay. This is perfect. So this is a nice break, because then we'll start up cartilage next time. So that was connective tissue proper that we just went through.